was wrong with him? What was wrong with him? Business had never been this good before. I mean, thanks to that mandated census from the government, he had never had so much business. This was going to be his best year ever, right? He should be loving life. He should be maybe making plans of his own for a trip, make it up to the Capitol, see what's going on up there. He could be making plans to grow and expand his business so that next year could be more profitable. He could at least be making plans on some nice things he could buy for his wife and kids, right? He should be loving life, but none of these happy, hopeful thoughts and plans were in his heart and in his mind. Instead, a sense of despondency or even despair had settled over him. You know, even though this latest requirement from the government was good for him and his business, he was far from happy with the way things were going in the government. In fact, like a lot of people, he knew he really just wanted to get rid of everyone that was running things and be able to govern themselves again. It's causing him some despair. Things at home weren't helping, right? Contrary to what seemed to be the popular opinion at home, he really was trying to be a good father and a good husband. But he also knew deep down that trying really hard is not the same as actually being a good father and a good husband. He knew his anger was a problem. He knew that he wasn't spending enough time with his family, right? He's spending too much time in the business. It's adding to the despair. Lately, even going to synagogue, it just was becoming a burden. He had this growing suspicion in the back of his mind that he was never going to measure up to the laws. I mean, just trying to keep track of them. There were hundreds of them. Just trying to keep track of them was exhausting, let alone trying to live by all of them. And the despair is just building more and more in him. So business was good. So what? In light of all the things that were weighing on him, what does a good year in business really matter? Well, as he's wiping the tables off and he's kind of wallowing in his despair a little bit, there's a knock on the door. It's a little bit late at night. You know, all the dinner food is gone. It's been put away, and most of the guests are settled into their rooms, so he's a little curious who's at the door. And when he opens the door, he's confronted by a most pathetic-looking couple. They look rough. They'd clearly been traveling for quite some time and some distance, and gauging by the swell of her belly, this was not a good time for them to be traveling. And then he cringes inside as he hears them say what he knew they were going to say. They're looking for a place to stay. His was the last inn that they had come to. Everyone else was full, just like he is. So he hated to do it, but he had to turn them away. He had to say, I got no room. And as he's closing the door on their downcast face, he has a sudden thought. And he opens the door again. He says, wait a minute. I don't have any rooms per se, but I do have a stable. And it's definitely, not comfortable, and it's definitely not clean with all the animals in there right now. But you can stay there if you want to. It's better than sleeping in the field, at least. So they thank him, walk around the building, and head towards the stable. He closes the door, and he thinks to himself, there you go, I did my good deed for the day. I helped that couple out. I went the extra mile, did more than I had to, and that'll be the end of that. Boy, was he wrong. He goes up and he gets, starts getting ready for bed himself, and just as he's about ready to settle down, the baby decides it's time to come, right? And it's really not a surprise. I mean, she was really pregnant, right? The baby decides it's time to come. And he had never given birth himself, obviously, but he and his wife had several kids, and so he knows the drill and how it goes. And this lady was no different than his wife. She sounded like she was being tortured. It was rough, right? But soon enough, her screams were replaced by that beautiful sound of a new baby crying. And he's not sure how long he stood at that window staring out towards the stable, listening to all that was going on, when suddenly there was another knock on the door. Now he's a little worried because it's late, right? He goes back downstairs, opens the door, and there in front of him is this unkempt group of shepherds. And they're asking him if he has anyone staying in his stable. And they're talking a mile a minute. They are super excited about something they saw while they were watching the sheep in the fields. And they're asking him, they're telling him, hey, we're looking for a baby that's supposed to be in a manger. How in the world would they even know about this? There's no way they heard what was going on in the stable from all the way up on their hillside with all those sheep making those noises. How could they possibly know what just happened? Well, he told them what he knew. And they excitedly ran around the corner towards the stable. And he ran back upstairs to his little room and back to that window. And he's watching the scene unfold. And he can't obviously hear what's going on out there. But he's watching these shepherds stumble all over themselves trying to get to the stable. And as they get closer, they slow down. And then they drop to their knees. He can't figure out quite what's going on. But it almost looks like they're worshiping or something. As he stands there watching this scene unfold, a strange thing begins to happen in him. All that despair, that despondency that he was feeling earlier starts to diminish just a little bit. And it's kind of like that moment when you first light a candle and it's just that teeny tiny flame flickering. Something begins to flicker in his heart. He feels like things have changed. He knows that, none of his concerns, none of the things that are weighing on him have changed really, but everything feels a little bit different. A sense of hope growing in his heart and in his mind. This morning, as we dive into week 3 of our series exploring the other side of Christmas, we're going to find that Jesus' arrival that day marks a transition from a world of despair to a world of hope. The prophet Isaiah says this in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1. He says, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations." Isaiah is a prophet. He has been given sight by God of future times, future events, things that would unfold at some point in the future from his perspective. And the first word that Isaiah uses in this verse is critical. He says, "nevertheless," meaning reality is about to shift. In the previous chapter, he was talking about the despair of the world, the despair that Israel was experiencing. But he says, nevertheless, things are going to change. There will be a shift. And he sees a time where the distress and the despair of this world is lifted. And he tells us that the region of Galilee, which is in northeast Israel, the region of Galilee will have the honor of being the source of that hope. This hope will come from Galilee. Did you know that while Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he spent his childhood and his teenage years and his early adult years in a town called Nazareth, which is in the region of Galilee? Jesus is the source. Jesus is the reason for the hope and the change and that transition from despair in our world to the realization of hope. And because we live on this side of Christmas, our despair can be replaced by hope. It can be replaced and offset by hope. Let's look at more of Isaiah's words and see just how Jesus does this. How does he turn our world from a place of despair to a place of hope? The first thing Isaiah says, as we look in chapter 9 here, about this turn from despair to hope involves light and darkness. And we're going to see that Jesus brings light to our darkness. He brings light to the darkness of our world, light to the darkness of our own lives. Look at verse 2 with me. "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." Now, in biblical writing, darkness is a metaphor for life without God. If you are living in darkness or walking in darkness, it's a life without God. And a life without God is a life of darkness, a life of despair, a life without great hope. I think this metaphor makes sense to us on an instinctual level, right? It's kind of hardwired into us to avoid dark places. And we know that the scary things happen in the dark, right? That's why kids are afraid of the dark. That's where scary things happen. Without God in our lives, we are the people living in darkness. We are walking in darkness without Him. It may be the darkness of abuse. It may be the darkness of loneliness, the darkness of depression, the darkness of anger and bitterness. On a larger scale in our world, we see it in the darkness of wars and the darkness of human trafficking, right? As we're talking about hope for Banchada, we see the darkness of this world when we exist outside of God. Our world has no shortage of examples of what it is to live in darkness. Now, the opposite of darkness is light, of course, right? And in the Bible, light is a metaphor for God. Darkness is life without Him. Light is a metaphor for God Himself. 1 John 1:5, even it just says it explicitly. John says, God is light, and in Him there is no darkness. And so we have this contrast between light and dark. And Isaiah sees this day when light would break into our dark world of despair. The world had been waiting for God to bring into reality the promise made way back in Genesis chapter 3. Pastor Gerald talked about this a couple weeks ago. God had promised that one would come who would crush the head of Satan, who would destroy our enemy. And ever since that fateful day, when sin entered our world, all of humanity was consumed by it and cast into darkness. For thousands of years, mankind waited in the dark, waited on God to provide a light, to send the one. That light dawned the day that Jesus was born. That light dawned the day the light of the universe entered our world with the sole purpose of banishing the darkness forever from creation. How do we know that Jesus is that light? Look at what Jesus says about Himself in John chapter 8 and verse 12. He says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, He said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus is the physical incarnation of the God of light in this world. And through His life and death and resurrection, God's light shines into the hearts, into the minds of all those who believe in Him. And those who believe in Jesus receive in them the God of light, the God who begins the work of transforming us into His image, right? Exchanging the darkness of our sin for the light of Jesus' righteousness in increasing degrees. So that the darkness of our anger is replaced by the light of gentleness. The darkness of our promiscuity is replaced by the light of purity. The darkness of our selfishness is replaced by the light of selflessness. The darkness of arrogance and pride is replaced by the light of humility. Jesus makes this exchange in increasing degrees in our lives. And then as we are being changed by the light of Jesus, we become like prisms. And we're reflecting God's light into our world. Right? We're prisms or mirrors reflecting God's light into our world. This is what Jesus says about you and I as His followers in Matthew chapter 5. He says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the home. In the same way, let your light shine before others. Why? That they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. As we are being changed by God, as we increasingly live out Jesus' teachings and His example to us, His light shines out of us, and it's like a beacon in the dark, so that those who have the eyes to see the light can find their way to the God of light. We live in a dark world, but the light of God is piercing that darkness more and more until one day he will banish it forever. But that's not all. Isaiah goes on in these verses as he talks about this turning from despair to hope. And he says, on this side of Christmas, Jesus will bring joy in our pain. He'll bring joy in the midst of our pain. Look at verses 3 through 5 with me of Isaiah 9. He says, you have enlarged the nation. You have increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle, every garment rolled in blood, will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. Now, because we live in a dark and broken world, there's going to be pain in this life, right? I don't need to convince you of this. If we had time to go around and hear from each person, we would have that many different examples and reasons for understanding and agreeing that there is pain in this life. We all encounter and endure pain. In verse 5, Isaiah references that. He speaks about the warrior's boot used in battle and the garments rolled in blood. These are representative of the hard things, the difficult things, the painful things that we experience in life. And Isaiah doesn't say, hey, if these things happen. He says they did happen. And they are happening, and they're going to happen again and again. We experience this pain, and this pain that we experience can lead to despair in our hearts. In fact, without a source of power, without a source of help, I think despair is inevitable in the face of the pain that we endure. And if there's no light at the end of the tunnel, if it just stretches on and on, then let's just set up camp right here. I'm just going to give up. Let's just stop and sit down where we are. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Remember? The light of God has dawned in this world. God's light is piercing into this world. And this is why Isaiah can speak of joy and rejoicing in the midst of all of this in verse 3. That the pain of life has not ended yet. We know that. But when when God's light broke into our darkness, he brought with him a sense of joy in the midst of that pain. Verse 4 tells us that this comes from Jesus. Isaiah invokes a national memory about a day called, he says, the day of Midian's defeat. And this is a reference to a battle that actually happened hundreds of years before Isaiah's time. It's when Israel was being oppressed, subjugated by the Midian people. And it was to the point that the Israelites would have to grind their wheat or whatever they had in secret. They would find a little corner, a basement somewhere. Because if they did it out in the open or in large batches, the Midianites would say, hey, thanks for doing that, and take it away from them. And so they were being severely oppressed. And in that environment, God calls Gideon to rise up and to lead an army against the Midianites. Now, the hope for us is in the strange strategy that God employs with Gideon. Gideon puts out the call for people to come to battle, and over 30,000 men show up to go to battle. God then begins the process of whittling that number down, eliminating different groups of people. And he whittles it down to such a point that when he's done, Gideon has less than 1% of what he started with. God says, now you're ready. Now you can go to fight. Less than 1% of what he started with. As the plan unfolds and Gideon follows God's direction, his small army kind of encircles the much larger army, and they're all spread out. And this is what they have: torches and trumpets and 300 swords, I guess, against a much, much larger army. Well, they're following God's direction, and in the midst of what they do at God's direction, God confuses the enemy army, and they end up mostly killing themselves. All Israel has to do is go in and clean up the stragglers, in the fight. What's the hope for us in this? Here it is. God will never encounter a problem or a situation that is too big for his power to make a difference and to help. In fact, his power and abilities shine the brightest when circumstances are completely stacked against him. When the enemy army is too big. When the Red Sea is blocking your way of escape. When the giant standing on the battlefield is too strong for you. That is when God's power and ability is most evident. I imagine that Gideon, he was really nervous before the battle started. He had his tiny army trying to surround this much larger army. But I think his sense of excitement and joy grew as he saw what God was doing, as they sat there and just watched the enemy killing themselves, because God's power was on display in the face of overwhelming odds. I think Jesus' birth is a great example of God's ability to bring his rescue and help in the face of overwhelming odds. Ever since, Genesis, man was locked up in slavery to sin. We were dead in our transgressions. We were lost in that darkness. And God's plan of rescue is to send one person. One person was supposed to overcome death and sin when no one else ever had. One person was supposed to set free all of mankind. Only a God as great as ours has the ability, the power to conceive of such a plan and then to make it happen and to pull off the rescue that seems impossible. Because of Christmas, because we are on this side of Christmas, we can have hope and joy in the midst of our painful and stressful experiences. The hope and joy that God can do something when you see no way for your marriage to survive. When you've been looking for that new job forever, and you're like, I don't know how in the world we're going to pay our bills. How are we going to do Christmas? When you or someone you know is going through a really difficult health crisis, and the doctors are saying, we don't know. We don't know. We can have hope and joy in the midst of that because we know that God has the ability to do the impossible. He can heal a body. He can provide a job. He can restore relationships in the blink of an eye. It doesn't matter how big the odds are stacked against him. And when he doesn't do that in the blink of an eye, instantly, we still have hope and joy because we know that his goodness and his love for us means he will take care of us. He will provide for us regardless of what happens. And that leads us to the third thing that Isaiah says about turning our despair into hope on this side of Christmas. And at this point, he starts to look even further into the future to a day when despair is completely eradicated from our world and our existence. And we see that Jesus brings the hope of eternity. Jesus brings the hope of eternity because of his arrival. Look at verses 6 and 7 with me. He says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and a government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever." Isaiah says all of this, all of the hope, all of the joy, all of the light, all of that's going to happen because there's going to be a baby born. And that son will be the reason for all of it. Now, Isaiah, he was looking forward to that day. We're looking backwards on that day. That's in our rear view as we see that Jesus is that child. Jesus is that son that has been given to us. He is the light and the joy and the hope of our world. He is our wonderful counselor, our mighty God, our Prince of Peace. And he will govern in this world, and he will sit and rule over all that exists. Now today, we experience that here in our hearts and in our minds as we yield our lives to him, as we learn to live by his teachings, as we surrender to his authority in our lives. We experience that in our lives. But there will be a day where he institutes a physical government in this world. And he will have some kind of physical throne or ornate desk, I don't know. He'll have some place where he sits and exerts and extends his will and authority in all of the world, and all people will yield to him, and it will be a world of peace and righteousness and justice, and there will be no more tears, there will be no more pain, there will be no more darkness, there will be no more despair in that day. And this is our ultimate hope. Because of his pureness, his holiness, his compassion, his gracious nature, that day is our ultimate hope. That no matter what we do experience in this life, because there will be pain, we do walk in the midst of darkness, even with Jesus in our hearts. There's darkness around us. No matter what we experience, one day he will make all things right for those that love him, for those that follow him. I wonder what you are experiencing in life right now, even as we sit here. What might be giving you reason to feel some kind of degree of despair in your heart and in your mind? To be honest, I'm not immune from that. I've got things going on in my life that cause me distress and despair. But because we live on this side of Christmas, all of that despair can be countered and changed by hope. Now, I say that it can be, because this is something we must receive from God. It's not an automatic, right? For those that have never trusted in Jesus, you've never reached that point where you've acknowledged your need for forgiveness and asked God to forgive you and surrendered the control of your life to him. If you've never reached that point, that is the first step to take before you can receive the hope and the joy and the light that God and Jesus makes available. And if you would like to take that step today, we just invite you to linger for a few minutes after the service. Our prayer team will be available to your right of the stage, and they would love to talk with you about that and to help you take that step to receive God's light and hope and joy into your life today. For the believer, for those who have taken that step, you've put your trust in Jesus, you're following him. We're told about the fruit of God's work in us. Things like love and joy and peace and patience, endurance through life. As God grows and develops these traits in us, his hope will grow more and more, and we will live with an experience of that, an awareness of that. So if you are, like me, just carrying some degree of despair or distress today, run to God. Cling to God. Turn to him, asking him to increase your awareness of his presence. He's with you all the time. Like, you never have less of God with you, but we don't always recognize it to the same degree. Say, God, increase my awareness of your presence with me, and increase the mark of your work in me. Give me more love. Give me more patience. Give me more hope. Give me more endurance. Increase these things in my life. Several of the at-home resources, either on the wall out in the lobby or on the website growfaithathome.org, are all about encountering God in our darkness, in our despair, and how does God's light and bring hope to us. I encourage you to explore some of those that may be relevant to whatever is going on in your life. Understand that your circumstances may not turn on a dime. That sense of distress or despair may not completely fade away immediately. But as we keep our focus on God, rather than focusing on our circumstances, that sense of hope in God can and will begin to grow and to overcome that sense, those feelings of distress and despair in our hearts and our mind as we cling to him and focus on him. Thinking beyond ourselves, consider who in your life might need to hear the good news of life on this side of Christmas. Who do you know that needs to hear that on this side of Christmas we have a Savior? That on this side of Christmas we have a liberator who sets us free from the control of sin? That on this side of Christmas there is hope that can replace our despair? Whoever that is in your life, we hope that you will extend an invitation to them this season, inviting them to come to maybe one of our Christmas Eve services. There are invite cards in your bulletin this morning, and we've got like piles of them out in the lobby. Take as many as you want or need. Who do you know that needs to experience this? Give them that card, snap a picture of it, and text it to them so they have the information. But extend that invitation. And then go the next several steps with them, right? Accommodate their schedule. Say, hey, I would love for you to come to church with me on Christmas Eve. Here are the time. When can you come? And that's when I'll be there. Don't expect them to meet your schedule. Meet their schedule. And maybe you can meet them out front or ride together so you can walk in together. You can be their host and their guide for that whole service. So they're never wondering, like, where am I supposed to go? This place is strange to me. Is that coffee free? I don't know. And they never have to wonder what's going on next because you're right there with them. And then you can extend that all-important second invitation. I'm so glad you were here. It was really great having you here with me. Will you come back? Will you come back with me again in the new year and just hear more about God's word and about Jesus? Because it's really important in my life, and I'd love for you to know more about that. Jesus said that you and I are the light of the world as we reflect and extend his light through us to others. Be the light of God in someone's life and extend that invitation to one of our Christmas Eve services. We live in a dark world, right? And we need God's light. And that gives us hope in the midst of the despair, joy in the midst of pain, and we have that eternal hope. Let's thank him for that today. Jesus, Father, we are so grateful to you for your goodness, that you have brought to us a Savior, a liberator, and hope. In this dark world, you've brought light. You have brought joy to our pain. And one day, you're gonna fix everything. We have an eternal hope because of our faith in Jesus, that you're gonna make all things right for us. So Lord, help us as we live and surrounded by darkness, as we experience and encounter pain. God, help us to live with a greater awareness of you in us. Help us to extend that light to others so that they too can know the amazing power of God on this side of Christmas. Amen.
Thanks, Dave.